Our story begins with a young man, disillusioned with life. He's frustrated, anxious, and deeply unsatisfied with where he stands. Like many of us, he feels that his life is dictated by external circumstances, things beyond his control. His childhood traumas, societal pressures, and past failures haunt him every day. He believes, as many people do, that our past shapes who we are and that we cannot escape it. He seeks answers, perhaps not to change his life, but to understand why it feels so out of his hands. Determined to find some solace, the young man decides to meet a philosopher who lives in seclusion. This philosopher, however, doesn't offer the typical advice one might expect from a life coach or a therapist. Instead, he teaches the principles of Adlerian psychology, ideas that are radically different from what most people believe about human behavior, happiness, and life's purpose. As they sit together in the philosopher's quiet home, the young man begins with skepticism. He's already convinced that his life, like so many others, is limited by his past. But as their conversation unfolds, something profound begins to happen. The young man's views are challenged, piece by piece, in a way that makes him question everything he has ever believed about himself, his relationships, and his future. Chapter 1. You Can Change, starting today. The philosopher's first bold claim is this: people can change at any moment, and the past does not determine your future. This simple statement feels revolutionary and almost impossible to the young man. How could that be? How could his past experiences, his upbringing, his failures, not shape who he is? But the philosopher calmly explains that what truly shapes us is not the experiences themselves, but the meaning we attach to them. He says the past is merely a collection of events, and these events don't have inherent power over us unless we give them that power. The young man pushes back. But how can someone who's experienced trauma, poverty, or heartbreak just decide to change? Isn't our emotional baggage too heavy to simply discard? The philosopher responds, "You're not angry because someone insulted you. You're angry because you chose to interpret the insult in a way that made you angry." People use their past as an excuse not to change because change is uncomfortable. But if you're willing to take responsibility for your interpretations, you can choose to change them. You can change the course of your life. Chapter 2. The Lie of Inferiority. One of the main reasons people feel trapped in their lives, the philosopher argues, is because they feel inferior. They feel that others are better than them and that they themselves are inadequate. This leads to feelings of inferiority, which then lead to inaction, fear, and avoidance. The young man admits that he constantly compares himself to others. He compares his job to the jobs of his friends, his appearance to celebrities, his lifestyle to that of social media influencers, and each time he feels a little worse about himself. But what he doesn't realize is that these feelings of inferiority are not innate, they are learned. According to Adlerian psychology, inferiority feelings arise because we constantly judge ourselves in relation to others. But these judgments are subjective, and the only thing they lead to is suffering. The philosopher tells the young man, there is no need to compare. You are not here to compete with anyone. Each person has their own unique purpose, their own unique path, and none of them are better or worse than yours. You only feel inferior because you've decided that other people's lives are somehow more valuable than your own. This idea strikes a chord with the young man. For the first time, he considers that perhaps his suffering has more to do with his mindset than with his actual circumstances. He begins to see that the feelings of inferiority he's been living with are not objective truths, but rather stories he has been telling himself. Chapter 3. The Courage to Take Responsibility for Your Life. As the conversation continues, the philosopher introduces an even more challenging concept. We choose how we live, and we must take full responsibility for those choices. This is where the young man truly struggles. Like many of us, he believes that external factors, the way others treat us, the opportunities we're given, the accidents of birth, determine our success and happiness. He believes that circumstances control our lives far more than we control them. But the philosopher counters this argument. He says, it is not the environment that shapes our destiny, but the way we choose to respond to it. He introduces the concept of task separation, which means understanding what belongs to you and what belongs to others. The young man is puzzled, so the philosopher explains further. Your life is your task. Others' opinions, actions, and reactions are their tasks. You cannot control what they think of you. You cannot control how they act, but you can control how you respond. For the young man, this is a revelation. He has spent so much time trying to control others' opinions, desperately seeking approval, and living in fear of rejection. But the philosopher teaches him that this is a waste of energy. You cannot please everyone, and it is not your job to do so. Your task is simply to live authentically and let others think what they will. Chapter 4. The freedom that comes from letting go of approval. The philosopher then introduces the central concept of the book, the courage to be disliked. Most people spend their lives seeking approval from others. They want to be liked, respected, and admired, and they shape their behavior around the pursuit of this validation. But this, the philosopher argues, is a trap. Seeking approval is a form of slavery because it ties your happiness to something outside of your control. It keeps you from living authentically because you are constantly adjusting your behavior to fit others' expectations. The philosopher says, you will never be truly free until you have the courage to be disliked. Until you can live without needing the validation of others, you will always be a prisoner to their opinions. The young man is initially resistant to this idea. He, like many people, has spent his life seeking approval. The thought of being disliked terrifies him, but as the philosopher explains, the freedom that comes with letting go of the need for approval is transformative. Once you stop worrying about what others think, you are free to live according to your own values and desires. This doesn't mean being selfish or inconsiderate. It means understanding that you cannot control others' reactions to you, and that their approval is not necessary for your happiness. Chapter 5. Accepting yourself as you are. One of the hardest lessons for the young man to grasp is the idea that self-acceptance is the key to happiness. In today's world, we are constantly bombarded with messages that tell us we are not enough. We are told we need to be thinner, richer, more successful, more popular, and more attractive. But the philosopher teaches that true happiness comes from accepting yourself as you are, without judgment or criticism. He says, you are not here to live up to anyone else's expectations. You are not here to achieve some arbitrary standard of success. You are here to be yourself, and that is enough. This idea is revolutionary to the young man, who has always felt like he needed to be more than he was. He begins to realize that the constant striving for perfection and approval has been the source of much of his suffering. He starts to see that happiness is not something you achieve by meeting certain criteria, but something you experience when you let go of the need to meet those criteria. Chapter 6. All problems are interpersonal relationship problems. One of the key insights of Adlerian psychology is that almost all of our problems in life stem from our relationships with others. Whether it's jealousy, insecurity, anger, or anxiety, these feelings are often rooted in how we relate to the people around us. The philosopher explains that much of our unhappiness comes from our desire to control others or be controlled by them. We either want people to like us, to behave in certain ways, or to give us the validation we crave. Or we allow others to control us by living in fear of their opinions or judgments. But once we understand the concept of task separation, what belongs to us and what belongs to others, we can free ourselves from this cycle. We can stop trying to control others and start focusing on our own tasks. This doesn't mean isolating ourselves or becoming indifferent to others. It means acknowledging that each person is responsible for their own life, their own happiness, and their own choices. The young man begins to see that his relationships have been a source of stress because he has been trying to manage other people's reactions and expectations. But by letting go of this need for control, he can start to build healthier, more fulfilling relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. Chapter 7. The courage to live authentically. As the conversation draws to a close, the philosopher offers one final, profound insight. The courage to be disliked is ultimately the courage to live authentically. Living authentically means living in alignment with your true self, without fear of judgment or rejection. It means pursuing your passions, expressing your true thoughts and feelings, and living according to your own values and not someone else's expectations. It's about standing up for what you believe in, even when it's unpopular, and making decisions that are right for you, regardless of how others may perceive them. The philosopher explains, living authentically requires immense courage. It means embracing the possibility that some people will not like you, but it also means freeing yourself from the chains of approval seeking and living a life of integrity. The only way to find true happiness is to live authentically and accept that some people will dislike you for it, and that's okay. The young man, after hours of deep conversation, starts to understand this. He sees that so much of his anxiety and unhappiness has come from living a life that isn't truly his own. He has been making decisions based on what others would think, seeking validation at the expense of his own desires, and avoiding risks out of fear of being judged. Now, he feels ready to embrace the idea of living authentically, even if it means that some people may disapprove of him. For the first time, he understands that happiness doesn't come from being liked by everyone, but from being true to yourself. Chapter 8. Happiness is a choice. The philosopher then drives home one of the most important lessons of Adlerian psychology. Happiness is a choice, not a result of external circumstances. Many people believe that they will be happy once they achieve certain goals, once they get the promotion, find the right partner, or have more money. But this, the philosopher says, is an illusion. Happiness, the philosopher explains, is something you choose in the present moment. It's not something you achieve after you meet certain conditions. You can choose to be happy right now by accepting your life as it is, by living authentically, and by letting go of the need for approval. This is a challenging concept for the young man, as it is for many of us. We are conditioned to believe that happiness is something we earn or achieve after overcoming obstacles or meeting specific criteria. But the philosopher argues that happiness is available to us at any moment, as long as we are willing to choose it. The young man is silent for a moment, absorbing the gravity of this statement. He realizes that much of his unhappiness has come from believing that he is not yet where he needs to be, or that he is not yet the person he should be. But the philosopher's words offer him a new perspective. He doesn't need to wait for happiness. He can choose to experience it right now by accepting himself and his life as they are. Chapter 9. The Danger of Living for Recognition. One of the most significant sources of unhappiness, according to the philosopher, is the human tendency to live for recognition. From a young age, we are taught that recognition, whether from parents, teachers, or peers, is a sign of success. We are conditioned to seek validation through awards, praise, and external achievements. But the philosopher argues that living for recognition is a dangerous trap. It leads to a life of constant striving, as we are always seeking more approval, more validation, and more praise. The more we seek recognition, the more dependent we become on the opinions of others, and the less we are able to live authentically. The young man admits that he has spent much of his life living for recognition. He has chosen his career based on what would make his family proud. He has pursued relationships that looked good on the outside, but left him feeling empty. He has prioritized the opinions of others over his own desires and dreams. The philosopher gently explains that true fulfillment comes not from seeking recognition, but from living according to your own values. He says, the moment you stop living for recognition, you begin to live for yourself, and that's when you find real happiness. This resonates deeply with the young man, who realizes that his relentless pursuit of external approval has been the root of much of his dissatisfaction. He begins to see that true happiness comes not from being recognized by others, but from recognizing his own worth and living in alignment with his values. Chapter 10. You are not the center of the universe. In a striking moment of clarity, the philosopher introduces a humbling but liberating idea. You are not the center of the universe. This is not meant to diminish the young man's importance, but rather to free him from the self-imposed pressure of feeling that everything is about him. The philosopher explains that much of our suffering comes from the belief that we are constantly being judged by others. We walk into a room and immediately assume that everyone is thinking about us, evaluating us, and forming opinions about us. But in reality, people are far more concerned with their own lives than they are with ours. The young man is taken aback by this idea. He realizes that he has spent so much time worrying about what others think of him, when in fact, they are likely too focused on their own problems to even notice him. This shift in perspective is freeing. The young man begins to understand that he doesn't need to be so self-conscious because most people are not paying as much attention to him as he thought. This realization allows him to let go of the constant need for approval and focus more on his own growth and happiness. Chapter 11. The Courage to Face Discomfort. One of the final lessons the philosopher shares is that true growth requires the courage to face discomfort. Change is never easy, and living authentically often means going against the grain, making difficult decisions, and facing criticism or rejection. The philosopher reminds the young man that avoiding discomfort is what keeps most people stuck in lives they are unhappy with. They avoid difficult conversations, they stay in jobs they hate, they maintain relationships that no longer serve them, all because they are afraid of the discomfort that comes with change. But the philosopher encourages the young man to embrace discomfort as a necessary part of growth. He says, "Discomfort is a sign that you are pushing beyond your limits, that you are challenging yourself to become the person you truly want to be. If you always seek comfort, you will never grow." The young man reflects on this, recognizing that much of his life has been shaped by a desire to avoid discomfort. He has avoided taking risks, making bold decisions, and pursuing his true passions because he was afraid of failure, rejection, or criticism. Now, with a new understanding, he realizes that discomfort is not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. It is through facing discomfort that he will grow into the person he truly wants to be. Chapter 12. The Courage to be Disliked. In the final moments of their conversation, the philosopher reiterates the central message of the book. The courage to be disliked is the courage to be free. Living authentically, pursuing your own path, and letting go of the need for approval will inevitably lead to situations where you are disliked by others. But this, the philosopher explains, is a necessary part of living a fulfilling life. You cannot please everyone, and trying to do so will only lead to misery. The philosopher reminds the young man that being disliked is not a reflection of his worth, but a natural consequence of living authentically. He says, "The people who dislike you are not rejecting who you are, but rather the idea of who they think you should be. And that's okay. You are not responsible for their opinions. You are only responsible for being true to yourself." The young man, now armed with the lessons of their conversation, feels a sense of clarity and empowerment. He understands that the fear of being disliked has been holding him back, but he also realizes that the freedom to live authentically is worth the risk of disapproval. With newfound courage, he leaves the philosopher's home, ready to embrace the life he truly wants, not the life others expect of him. The path to happiness. As the young man walks away, he reflects on everything he has learned. He understands now that happiness is not something he will find in the approval of others, but something he will create within himself. He knows that living authentically will require courage, but he also knows that it is the only path to true fulfillment. The philosopher's final words echo in his mind. The courage to be disliked is the courage to be free. And with that, the young man begins a new chapter in his life, one where he no longer seeks validation from others, but finds peace and happiness in being true to himself. The philosopher closes the dialogue by emphasizing that the pursuit of happiness is an individual responsibility. Happiness is not something that can be achieved through external validation or material success. It is an internal state that comes from living authentically and embracing the courage to be disliked. The young man leaves with a new perspective, realizing that while it's difficult to change one's mindset overnight, the journey to self-acceptance and freedom begins with understanding these core principles.